Hello and welcome to yet another tutorial of Project Succession. Today we learn about the newest feature of the tool, which came in with 0.7, and we will today talk about custom Python nodes. Project Succession on its own already has 238 nodes at this timestamp. This number will continue to grow. I will continue to provide you integrated nodes. But for the very custom needs, whenever you need like a specific node very often and you can't just make a little script node whatsoever, but you want to have a real full-fledged node, you can now do this. So the very first thing we want to do is we want to enable the feature. For this, we look into our settings. So let's look at the settings and we scroll all the way down and there we see our custom Python section. So yeah, you see, for example, in my case, I need the Python 3 interpreter because I'm on Mac. If you have your Python interpreter on installed and on the path, this will obviously find it. If not, you need to provide like a full, you need to provide a full path to it, right? So you can also then say, hey, I have here my home folder, and then I don't know wherever you have Python installed. In our case, we just select Python 3. So let's use that. And there you see then directly what version is installed and what we will run with. In my case, it's 3.9.6. But obviously, this is a security thing. I'm just using with this feature your Python installation on disk. So if your Python installation has a custom package, this custom package can be used. If you want to install additional capabilities, you do this through pip or like Conda or your package manager of choice. I'm not shipping with like Project Succession does not ship with its own Python interpreter. So let's just enable the custom nodes, quickly refresh the nodes and save the changes. So at the moment, this here is actually not affecting the backend. Still, if you want to be fully up to date, I would recommending just quickly killing the backend and the front end and just quickly launching it again, right? So let's just open it again real quick. And here we are. So let's reload real quick to be up to date and have everything refreshed. And now we have, if we look again, the custom nodes enabled, everything good, and we can start building our custom nodes. For that, we go into the user home.project succession folder. You find this as soon as you install Project Succession and launch it first. This will be created. There you find your settings, right? And you also find your audit logs, your normal logs. I can actually clear these up real quick. And also a custom nodes folder. If this doesn't exist yet, you need to create it, obviously. In here, you can create and sort your folders like you want to. You don't need to actually use this location. You can also, in the settings, define a custom node directory. So by default, it looks in this folder, but you can also reroute that easily to wherever you want to store. You can also just install from Git, and this will basically just clone the Git repository with all its Python files into that folder. What does this allow you? You can easily share via Git your custom node definitions and others can install them. So let's go back here. Let's create a little folder and call this tutorial. And in this folder, we open up real quick IDE. Not an IDE, a little shell. And there we can now just touch real quick a tutorial action.py. I already did this once. This is why I'm getting offered an autocomplete. And now I have my py script here. So let's open that up. We have an empty file now. So this one here we can actually close. We don't need the actual finder anymore. But what is a tutorial action actually, or like what is a custom node actually compound of? You have also under help documentation, you can just look for custom Python nodes, right? And there you get like a description of how to build your nodes. In our case, I'll show you this is what the tutorial is for, right? So the very first thing we need is a node ID. So project succession is looking for some constants. We call this node greeting node. This is an identifier. It is kinda unique, or has to be kinda unique. At least it has to be unique within the folder you are in. And the file name is also playing into it, so it's project succession has some measurements to make this unique, but it's good practice to have like a unique identifier for your ID. But for obviously providing a name to the node, we can just come in with node name. This is also a required parameter, and there you just give in the label of the node. What is the node called? The user. So in this case, we want to make a node which just like says, hello, I'm a node. So we do this. Then we also need to define a category. All of these are like fixed constant names project succession is expecting in your script. We give this just a tutorial category real quick and a node description. There we just say this will simply provide a greeting to the output. Then we have a list of parameters. Parameters are defined in a dictionary, and one parameter is one dictionary, and you have a list of these, right? So we have a parameters, and at the moment we do an empty list. Same for inputs. And for outputs. And last but not least, we need to define the execute method. So we have one method which we call execute. Let's just pass here real quick. And this method is basically called when we execute the node. It takes in 3 parameters. This is also important. So one being the config, one being the inputs, and one being the secrets. So this is basically what project succession requires as the minimum harness to display the node. And you see directly we now have 239 and 238 nodes. This basically refreshed in real time. And now if we look for tutorial, we have our greet the user node. It doesn't have any inputs, it doesn't have any outputs, and it just has this little square which doesn't do anything. That's like the minimum harness. Let's go in here and now define some stuff. So first we want to obviously have an input. And as I already said, inputs, parameters, etc. are all built via individual dictionaries, and an input always needs to have a name. And this name basically is the index of this input. This is like hard-coded to be input 0, or if you have a second input, it has to be input 1, 2, etc. So this is something we cannot choose. But what we can choose is the label. And the label actually is nothing else than a description which comes on if you hover over this port or this input. And you can give it like a little, yeah, this is expecting this type of data to come in, etc. Usually it's a good practice to separate data from execution, like left to right being parameters holding the data, and inputs and outputs just triggering the execution flow. But in this tutorial, I will actually use also an input as a data input. So I want to have the name of the user here. So we just type in name as a little nudge. So I please put in a string there, right? And we define a type, which would be of type string. So this is the very minimum thing we need to do. So now suddenly our node, let's make this a little bit, let's not make this smaller, otherwise it doesn't look as good. But now we have an input, and the same we do for our output, right? So we can basically just copy this. Just instead of input 0, we write in output 0. So the names are always like hard-coded, like you have to use these names. But then in our case here, we give it a different label because we output a greeting, right? And we also need to tell the output one more thing, which is the identifier. And the identifier is basically what will be the key which the output will be passed to. So in our case, we call this greeting, and now we have also a little output. If we hover over this, you see here we have name, there we have greeting. Everything is pretty custom. And we also want to have a few parameters, right? So let's create parameters for this. For parameters, we again define a dictionary, and there we probably want to have a name. So name is also like required. This is how we get the parameter, etc. So we call this greeting too. We give it a label, call this greeting 2. So this basically, what should the greeting even be? We then need a type of this parameter, which is in our case a string. All the available different types of parameters are also described in the documentation. So, and then last but not least, this is optional, but I would say we should definitely do this, is provide a default value. If not, the parameter will just be empty. So here we can just say hello as the default parameter. And now you see we got a parameter in our node when saving, which is called greeting, and the default value is hello. Let's add another one. Let's copy this. Like this. And now we have, in theory, 2 times the same one, but this is not what we want. We want to have, obviously, here. Should this be shouted? So we just type in shout as one parameter, and we give it a label. And this should be not a string, but a Boolean, right? And there we can say, okay, by default, we don't want to shout at someone. So we type it as false. And voila, now we got a Boolean value. All of that is pretty smoothly, as you can see. Um, and with that, we already have a little bit more of our node. It doesn't do anything or return anything, etc. at the moment. So how do we actually now get all of the values in our execution? So instead of just passing the method here, we can get the actual values. So let's get our name from our inputs dot get. We probably want to have our input 0, and from the input 0 we want to get the value. So the value, like project succession, comes with this identifier type value struct. Like when data comes in, it will almost always have an identifier, a type, and a value. So what we do here is we basically get the value of the first input. I'm not looking for like type safety right now, like obviously you, or like if it's existing, etc. So this obviously will return null here, and then you would need to check, hey, is, because get is not on a null object, so yeah, it will fail if this is not existing, but then obviously the node will fail and you need to fix it. Let's also find the prefix. So our greeting. And this one we can get from the config because it's a parameter. And there we just get greeting. We don't need to get the value in this case because the config is already like structured. So we just get the config here, the greeting directly here. And then last but not least, we also want to have our shout boolean, which we also get from the config.get shout. So now we should have all the different values in our execute method, which we get passed in. Like, it isn't a lot of code. This is now, like, with spaces and everything, it's 21 lines to define like this functionality, right? And this is just the harness. Now you can go wild and do whatever you want. So let's define the actual output string, which will be an f string. Let's say here we have our name. No, first we want to have our prefix, and then we obviously want to have our name. So in this case, this would say hello, name, or like whatever the prefix is. Then obviously if shout is existing, then we want to say, okay, our string is actually not just our string, but our string dot upper, to be like all uppercase because we're shouting, right? And now the interesting part to make the node fully functional and also work with, like, the node will also, if you just return a string, it will just return a string, but it will obviously break the downstream nodes because nodes in general expect this 3 type output. So our output value will be, again, a dictionary of this 3 type structure called identifier. And here we put in the identifier we put in also up here, right? So this would be the greeting. You can just quickly paste it in here. Then we have a type of this. Is this just then, if you're not sure, you can put in object. Types are not enforced, but it helps project succession to display like warnings, hey, you might have a mismatch in type, etc. But it's not really enforced. And here you actually see like, hey, we saved this and now this is actually broken because we don't return anything, etc. So let's type in string here. And last but not least, we want to put in our value, which will be our actual string, right? And then let's return our whole status. So the return block is also important. Here we need to define a status. And this is either success or fail. In our case, we succeed, obviously. We want to have a message, which is basically just a fancy word of like giving a little description. Hey, this is basically what the data is about. Greeted the user. And then lastly, we have our output data. If we would have multiple outputs, we would basically put all of that into a struct like this here, right? So output data is always a dictionary. And then you define the output it should go into. So output 0. And then you put in the actual output data, which is, in our case, our value. Like our value is already structured, right? So we can just put it here. If not, we can also obviously say identifier greeting value. So now, if we save this whole thing, something broke. Let's just quickly reload the node definitions. And okay, it's not existing anymore. So I just quickly debugged a little bit and we found directly the issue of why this node is not found anymore. If you go into your settings and you scroll down, you find load errors in our case, and we see, okay, we have actually an issue. Value identify greeting string value string. We have a syntax error in our value definition. So in here. Yes. So here we're missing the type, obviously. And this will now load the node again, like it should be. Nice. So this was actually a really good case of what happens if you misspell. The node will just not be found, and the settings will tell you why. But now we have our working node, and let's actually execute this. So we create a start trigger. This is like the most used trigger ever, just to test stuff, right? And then we provide a string, which will be our name. Here we just type in this is my name. And then we can pass in the name here and say maybe hey, and let's log this whole thing. Let's save this real quick as test.json. Yes, let's replace this. And now if we execute this, we get, hey, error. Nice, our custom nodes works. If we want to shout, we just type in shout, and now it's all uppercase. So this is obviously a pretty simple example of how to define a custom node. You can do a whole bunch of stuff in here, right? You can start your own threads with multi-threading. You can like start tools, everything you can do with Python, you can do here too. Um, so yeah, this is the way to make custom notes in project succession. I hope you liked the tutorial and have a wonderful day. Cheers.